Hi, everyone. As we wait for people to join in, I'll note that we are recording this session today, and we'll get started in just a few moments. Okay, it looks like we can get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Diana Dragaris, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the National Zoning Atlas. We are happy you joined us today for our New Hampshire Zoning Atlas reveal. For anyone who is unfamiliar with our work, the National Zoning Atlas is a collaborative of researchers digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing U.S. zoning codes. We are housed within the Legal Constructs Lab at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and we work under the direction of our founder and director, Sarah Bronin, who developed our novel methodology that explains how to gather data about local zoning laws and funnel that data into a standardized online map. Our research collaborative is comprised of over 24 teams across the country who utilize this methodology to create zoning atlases for their respective regions or states. We are united by the belief that zoning codes have tremendous impacts on our built and natural environment, economy, and social fabric. But zoning codes as they exist today are overcomplicated and antiquated, creating a black box that precludes most people from really understanding the legal constraints that shape how buildings are built and how land is used. We believe a demystification of zoning will prepare all stakeholders, everyone from policymakers to planning professionals to regular people, to answer questions like, why is there so much traffic? How flood resilient is my community? And why is housing so expensive? I encourage you to check out our website at zoningatlas.org and to follow our platforms to learn more about the work of the Zoning Atlas and our State Atlas projects. So today we are very excited to shine the spotlight on the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas and share the stage with the project's leadership team. Released in May of this year, New Hampshire is the third ever statewide zoning atlas to be completed using the NZA methodology. We have a stacked cast today, so I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll turn it over to the team to discuss their atlas findings, the public response, and what comes next. We'll all reconvene for an audience Q&A at the end, so I encourage everyone to use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout their presentation. First up, I'll introduce Max Latona. Max, in addition to his role as executive director for the Center of Ethics in Society at St. Anselm College, serves as the director of the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. I want to especially thank Max for his years-long dedication to the NZA, for his leadership not just in New Hampshire, but for other states when they call on him for guidance, and for his help in organizing this event. We also have Ben Frost, who is Deputy Executive Director and Chief Legal Officer at New Hampshire Housing. We have Emily Hamilton, Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center. We have Noah Hodgetts, Principal Planner at the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development. Rick Lederer Barnes, who is GIS Specialist and Environmental Planner at Upstate GIS. Sarah Marchant, Chief of Staff and Vice President of Resident-Owned Communities at the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. And finally, Jason Sorens, Senior Research Faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research. So I think with that, I will stop sharing and I will turn it over to Max.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but before I do so, I just want to thank you for the kind words and for the National Zoning Atlas team and Sarah Bronin for their support of the New Hampshire project and for this opportunity today to share our project with this audience. So thank you for that. And without further ado, I'm going to jump into our slideshow. So, okay, so the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. So what is it? Well, as with other atlases that have already been released or that are in development, it's a collaborative project to research, catalog, digitize, and graphically display all of New Hampshire's housing-related zoning regulations, community by community, district by district. In the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, we'll share with everyone some details of our Atlas project, the scope of our work, how it was rolled out here in New Hampshire, some of our select findings, but then also how the Atlas has been received here in New Hampshire, maybe some evidence of its potential impact, and then what our plans are for phase 2. Before we jump into it, I do want to say that I think any success that we've had or will have is, I think, largely due to the collaborative nature of this project. The Center for Ethics and Society has taken a lead, but we have had a number of important partners, most notably the State Housing Finance Authority, New Hampshire Housing, but also the state's Office of Planning and Development. So they were important collaborators and leaders in this whole project. In addition, our team, as you can see here today, has members with a variety of areas of expertise, ranging from land use regulations to planning to municipal governance to ethics. All of them contributed, and all of them come from a variety of different institutional backgrounds or affiliations. So a lot of collaboration there. We've also had a variety of funding support from different organizations, private corporations, foundations, national foundations. And then I would just say that, we've received input in the Atlas development from a host of community members and constituencies, including developers and housing advocates, planners and community leaders. So all of that collaboration and support, I think, has helped us to develop an excellent tool, but also one that has widespread credibility in the community and, reaches across ideological, political, and industry sectors. So it's our hope that collaboration and this tool will stimulate an ongoing discussion and understanding, both at the community level and at the state level, about how our zoning has impacted our housing supply and its affordability. And finally, I'll just say, by way of introduction, I thank all of you in the audience for tuning in to find out what's happening here in New Hampshire and to welcome any questions and comments that you might have. We're going to move through these slides somewhat briskly, and we'll definitely have time at the end for any comments or feedback. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Jason Sorens, to discuss just a little bit of the Atlas data and methodology. So, Jason.
Okay, so we followed very closely the NZA methodology, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with some New Hampshire tweaks. So we looked at not just zoning ordinances, but subdivision and site plan review ordinances, as well as the zoning maps to try to figure out what the regulations were district by district. In addition to the normal variables that the National Zoning Atlas includes, we also split up 4+ family into 4 family and 5+ family, because in New Hampshire, state law defines workforce housing in part as housing in 5-unit structures and greater. So we did, in fact, end up seeing some differences in how 4 and 5 family were treated in many towns. We also looked at manufactured housing because we thought that was significant. And there were some other variables that we included, like minimum road frontage, that were important in our local context. But overall, we followed the NZA methodology, and everything that we produced is consistent with that. And you can compare our results to those of other states that have their own atlases using this methodology. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Jason. we'll talk a little bit about now the development and launch of the Atlas, just to give people a sense of how long this project took and some of the important steps along the way. So this all began with a visit from Sarah Bronin to New Hampshire and our center for our Housing We Need statewide forum in December of 2021. And those of us from the center and New Hampshire Housing and the State Office of Planning and Development got together and said, why don't we do this in New Hampshire? So in January, we formed our collaboration. And then, after a few months of collecting funding and hiring important members of the team, then we undertook the data and the GIS work that lasted about 8 months or so. And an important shout out to all of our students who did all of the difficult coding. As many of you know in the audience here, that's the difficult work in producing this atlas. So thank you to our students for doing that. So after completing the coding and the verification work and the bulk of the GIS work by December of 2022, we started to develop the presentation collateral. That included the story map or the guided introduction, the interactive atlas itself, the website, and all of the different pieces on the website. And then I think that was important for our impact is reaching out to many of the constituencies that are stakeholders in this issue of housing affordability in the state. So we undertook a lot of work in doing pre-briefings with those groups, whether they were the Planning Association, Municipal Association, the Workforce Housing Coalitions, the state chambers of commerce, and so on. So we tried to reach out to many of these constituencies to help them sort of come on board as partners, if you will, or ambassadors for this project before the public launch, and also to sort of share the word about this once it did go public. So and then on May 8th, we did a pre-briefing with a dozen or so major media outlets. That was important for some of the media coverage that you'll see a little bit later. And then we had a public launch, an in-person event on May 9th, and kind of returned to where we started and invited Sarah Bronin, and she came up for our public launch, and we had a bit of a celebration and a revealing of the Atlas. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to, sorry, folks, to our interactive Atlas presentation and to Rick Lederer Barnes. So Rick, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Great, thanks, Max.
You're on mute, Rick.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Max. So as Max mentioned, we have a website that was created for the project. And so I just want to really briefly show you the website because this houses both the interactive atlas and a few other things. The website has our key findings, which the team is going to go through in a couple minutes. There's what we call a visual summary of the atlas. This is a story map format for those familiar, which has the methodology, the findings, and some other details about our process. We have our interactive atlas, which I'll show you momentarily, including a tutorial on how to use the atlas. Our downloadable assets, so that's where you can download all the data, both the GIS and the tables, in order to do your own analyses moving forward. Max mentioned our interns. We have a video presentation from our interns about what they got out of the project, and of course our leadership team and contact information. So if we explore the atlas, when you click there, you'll get a splash screen that gives a little background on what the atlas is and also what it isn't. We defer to the official zoning code for people to make their decisions on land use, but this gives them a nice overview to get them started. Then there's another little pop-up explaining some of the tools and how to use the atlas, as well as links back to the summary. So here's our atlas. We have it color-coded by primarily residential districts in orange, mixed with residential. So Those are districts that are allow both residential and commercial uses, and then non-residential in sort of this dark purple. Those could be possibly industrial or conservation lands. And on here, you have the ability to search both by an address or by a jurisdiction. You can, of course, zoom in and out on the atlas. If you click on the atlas, you'll get a pop-up that'll tell you about the jurisdiction you clicked on. It'll break down the amount of land that's zoned for residential, for mixed uses, for industrial, commercial, and then the non-buildable area of that town. And then also for the residential, a further breakdown of single family 2, 3, 4, and 5 plus. So a lot of our data is based on the buildable area. In New Hampshire, the northern part of the state, there's a lot of White Mountain National Forest that is obviously not developable. And then there's a lot of wetlands and water throughout the state. Now on the left, we have a series of toggles that allow you to visualize at a glance how the state is zoned. If I wanted to see, where in the state are duplexes allowed, I can click that toggle, and now everything's showing in yellow or orange is where duplexes are allowed either by right or through a hearing process. Similarly, Jason mentioned, New Hampshire, we have 5+ family housing. So if I click that, we can see, where throughout the state 5+ housing is allowed. Then we have other toggles, detached ADUs, accessory dwelling units, age-restricted multifamily, where it's only allowed for affordable housing, manufactured housing. We have breakdowns of those, where is it allowed in parks, where is it allowed only on individual lots. If I click that on, you can see these are the zoning districts where manufactured homes are allowed only on individual lots. And then we have a few more toggles down here, and this allows you to sort of, do a little querying of your own. If you wanted to say, where in the state is 1 acre lots possible in the state for single family housing. You click that, give it a second to spin, and you see these are all the districts that allow a 1 acre lot. Conversely, you could look at it the other way. Say, where in the state do they have a minimum of 10 acres for a single family lot? And we can see there's actually several areas in the state that have that. And actually, you can even do 20 acres minimum lot size, and you can see there's several districts in the state that actually you need 20 acres to build a single family lot. So that's the Atlas in a nutshell. It's the best way to see it is to really play with it. And like I said, if you go to nhzoningatlas.org, there's a link to this interactive atlas on there. So with that, I will turn it back over to Max.
Thanks, Rick. So now we're going to go back to our slideshow to talk a little bit about some of the findings that we've culled from this Atlas data set that we've developed, as well as the Atlas that Rick showed you. So hopefully everybody can see my screen now, and we're going to talk a little bit then about these statewide findings. So I'll start with Jason.
All right, thanks, Max. So here we go. Finding number 1 looks at small lot single family. As you saw from Rick's demonstration just now, there isn't a lot of space where even single family housing is allowed on lots of less than 1 acre. So here you see in this map in orange where small lot single family is allowed. That is defined here as less than 1 acre lots and less than 200 minimum feet of road frontage. Interestingly, only 16% of the state's buildable land areas, are already excluding conservation areas and wetlands of 10 acres or more, Already excluding those areas, only 16% of the remainder is available for small lot single family under average conditions. And by average conditions, we mean they're averaging over the different types of utility requirements or soil conditions that may apply. If we look at under ideal conditions, so assuming that everything is hooked up to water and sewer and all of that, it's still only 19% of the land area that would be available for small lot single family. And under worst case scenario conditions, if nothing is hooked up to water and sewer, then it's 13% of the buildable area that's available for small lot single family. Next slide.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And now we're going to turn over to Noah Hodgetts from the Office of Planning and Development to talk about findings 2 and 3.
Great. Thank you so much, Max. So finding number 2 looks specifically at small lot 2 family, and there's actually, maybe not surprisingly, even less area zoned for small lot 2 family homes or duplexes than there is for any other type of housing. Specifically, the map on the right shows that 2 family is allowed in areas in orange on less than an acre and with less than 200 feet of frontage with a minimum density of 2 units per acre on only 11% of the state's buildable area. When you're looking at average soil and infrastructure conditions, as Jason highlighted a second ago, some areas with water and sewer, hooked up to water and sewer, some without. But even if you looked at just the ideal conditions, say areas with the best soils that are connected to water and sewer, percentage of buildable area where 2 family or duplexes are allowed on small lots only increases from 11% of the state's buildable area to 14% of the state's buildable area. And I think Jason kind of highlighted a second ago, but just a reminder, the buildable area, we're saying we've excluded wetlands, roads, all large bodies of water over 10 acres. And in 70 full jurisdictions, 2 family is not allowed by right anywhere in the entire municipality. Next slide, please. The finding number 3, now looking at small lot multifamily, which we're defining as 5 or more units. Again, many of New Hampshire's communities, including those close to job markets, require larger lots. This is shown on the map on the right, where you see that only 21% of the state's buildable land area allows small lot 5+ family, which we've defined as less than 2.5 acres with less than 300 feet of frontage and with a minimum density of 2 units per acre. This map is showing that only 21% of the state's buildable land area, shown in orange, allows 5+ family on small lots. An additional 1% the state's buildable area allows multifamily or 5+ family on small lots in age-restricted elderly housing districts and or in affordable housing or workforce housing overlays. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Noah. And for finding number 4, we're going to turn it over to Sarah Marchant. Sarah.
Thank you. So this is a little bit of a deep dive reviewing the same kind of findings you saw in 1 through 3, but this is focused in a little bit deeper on New Hampshire's largest metropolitan area, Manchester, and its 7 contiguous communities. And what you see here is how kind of conservative, just looking at this by zoning is. Diving in here, you can see 21% of the land area in Manchester allows for single family homes on small lots, that same 1 acre, less than 1 acre, less than 200 feet of frontage. But when we overlay existing development, so we're looking at building footprints, impervious surfaces, and some land cover data, the actual amount of land available for new single family housing on small lots drops to less than 8%. Next slide, Max. This shows the same findings for both the duplex, the small lot 2 family, and small lot 5 family. And what you see when we overlay the development of the existing land area that's already developed, we're looking at less than 2% of the land area being available for new duplexes today
on small lots with less than 200 feet of frontage, less than 2%. It's a little bit bigger for the 5 family, and that's just under 4% of the land area being available for by right 5 family development. And if you add in the ones with restrictions, which would be some kind of an age restriction or affordability restriction, it does go up and add almost an additional 7% in. In New Hampshire, we do have a unique workforce housing law, and workforce housing is required by communities, and that starts being counted at 5 units and larger. And so that probably explains the difference of why communities have so much less allowance for duplexes than 5 families, as the 5 families starts to get them to that workforce housing solution. But as you can see, when we really dive in and look at this, there's very small amount of land available for future development.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And now for finding number 5, we will turn it over to Emily Hamilton.
Thanks, Max. Finding number 5 covers the Atlas's characterization of localities' ADU policies. In 2017, the New Hampshire State Legislature passed a law requiring localities across the state to allow accessory dwelling units at the site of single-family houses. But this law leaves open the door for localities to adopt some of the restrictions covered by the Atlas that can still act as barriers to accessory dwelling unit construction. So given this law, it's unsurprising that the Atlas identifies that by and large, accessory dwelling units are permitted on the residential land within New Hampshire. But in only 42% of this land are they allowed by right, and with less than 2 parking spaces required for the accessory dwelling unit specifically. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And now we'll wrap up our findings with finding number 6 and go back to Sarah Marshall.
Thank you. So finding number 6 looks at manufactured housing. In many ways, we have stopped looking at manufactured housing, but it's truly one of the only naturally occurring affordable housing options in New Hampshire. We have a lot of talk about affordable housing that's around rental and multifamily, but this is a form of true home ownership where the owners can build wealth through the purchase and ownership of a manufactured home. So it's an incredibly important part of the housing ecosystem, both here in New Hampshire and nationally. So it's important to dive in and look at this. When we saw the results from these findings, we were looking at small lots here, 1 acre or less, and 200 feet of frontage to allow 1 manufactured home. And what we find is that there's just under 10% of the land available in the state today that would allow for a manufactured home to be placed on the lot or within a park with that kind of density.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So those are our 6 sort of statewide findings that we initially pulled from the data set. But there's almost an unlimited number of findings that can be cultivated from the data set, and we hope to do more of that, as you'll hear about in maybe phase 2. But also we encourage other members of our community to use the data set to try and understand how housing is impacting housing supply and affordability, because the data set is available for everybody. So with that, I am going to turn now to community reception and Atlas impact. So as you know, the Atlas was launched on May 9th. So it's only been a few months, and it's actually between legislative sessions and also after our town meetings when many zoning changes get enacted in our community. So we haven't seen a lot of legislation or community decisions that reflect the Atlas quite yet. But we're 2 things. We have seen some signs of that, and you'll hear about that now going forward. And also we're kind of hopeful in the next year that we're going to see some evidence of conversations happening at the community and the state level, and hopefully some policy changes. So here are some of those sort of good signs. So first, we had tremendous media coverage for the Atlas. So this, I think, showed that there's a strong interest in the state, not just in the media, but in the public, for issues that concern the housing affordability. So the atlas was covered in a variety of news outlets, including the Boston Globe and New Hampshire Union Leader. We did have a spot on the evening news, television news, and so on. So you can see some of those outlets listed there. But we also had some unsolicited editorials that have been published in recent months that have referenced our atlas, including one powerful piece from a young mother who was a New Hampshire born and raised, and she declared that she and her husband were thinking about moving their young family out of state because they couldn't buy a home. And she cited our atlas and the work that we had done to detail how it's difficult in many of our communities throughout New Hampshire to build starter homes and to afford starter homes. So that's been encouraging coverage from the media. In addition, we have some hard evidence of changing attitudes in New Hampshire. A July statewide survey of New Hampshire voters revealed that 60% of New Hampshire voters now think that New Hampshire towns and cities should change their land use regulations in order to allow for more housing to be built. And as you can see from the graph here, that's a pretty significant change from the previous year. Support for these kinds of changes rose from 52% to 60%. And people who disagreed with this statement declined from 40% to 34%. So that's a net change of 12 to 26%. So that indicates that more and more people are not only in support of more affordable housing, but of this important measure that we have to adjust some of our zoning in our communities to make housing more buildable. And it makes me think that I think that most people probably don't even understand what zoning actually does, much less its impact on supply and affordability. But this is an encouraging sign if 60% of voters actually can recognize that and support those kind of changes. So that indicates to us that the work that not only our atlas is doing, but other partners in the state is beginning to work, and that we're beginning to reach the average voter and understanding what we need to do to change the landscape here. So with that said, I'm going to also turn it over now to Emily to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in communities to try and inform their conversations.
Thanks, Max. The leadership team has had the chance to present to several housing organizations across New Hampshire, as well as officials in some of the localities across the state. Most recently, we got to talk with the planning board in Conway. And Conway has implemented some recent changes intended to make it easier to build more housing there. In particular, some reforms to their accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Conway has already gone beyond the requirements of state law to permit both attached and detached accessory dwelling units, where state law only requires localities to permit attached ADUs. They've also eliminated their owner occupancy requirement for ADUs, as well as generally parking requirements for them. But the one remaining real barrier to ADU construction in Conway is that they are only permitted through a special exception process. And we talked with leaders there about opportunities to make it easier for homeowners to build ADUs by allowing them to be built by right, rather than requiring the homeowner to go to what might be a contentious community meeting. Next slide, Max.
Great, thanks, Emily. And we hope to do more of these community conversations in the ensuing months. We really enjoy actually working with community members, pulling out some of the data that applies to that community, some of the graphics, and helping to inform their conversations. So thank you, Emily. And so now we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about some legislative signs of the legislative impact, and as well, maybe our phase 2 plan. So now we're going to turn it over to Ben Frost, a super valuable member of our team. Ben?
Thanks so much, Max. I'm going to talk about where do we go from here. So next slide, Max. One thing we recognize is that zoning is not natural law. It's not delivered unto us from on high. it is created by we humans, and we humans can change it, and that's okay. In New Hampshire, housing and housing affordability is the #1 issue. This is based on a UNH, the University of New Hampshire survey of residents of the state. It is the top issue facing our population right now. The question is, does the legislature agree? So as zoning is a legislative act, we look at municipalities and how they've implemented zoning, but it very much is a creature of state legislative action, either to restrict municipal functions in home rule states, or as in New Hampshire, a Dillon's rule state, to enable municipal action to adopt zoning. I'll note, look at the sidebar here. The New Hampshire House of Representatives is a particularly unwieldy group. It's 400 members, and they're essentially volunteers. So you look at the hair color of the people in this photograph, which captures about half of the House of Representatives. The rest are off camera. We just didn't have a lens that was wide enough to get them all. And we currently have an evenly divided House of Representatives, with 3 special elections coming up that could tip things and tip the balance of control. What we do know is that the House is paying attention. The legislature is paying attention. And the House of Representatives, the Speaker, formed a special committee on housing to look at come up with legislative solutions. And some of the things that are coming out of that committee that we look for introduction in the 2024 session are a bill to deal with accessory dwelling units. Emily talked about the enactment in 2017 that had all kinds of flexibility for municipalities. Well, that flexibility in some municipalities is really a problem for the deployment of ADUs, making it virtually impossible to do. And so we're looking to pull back on some of the compromises that were wrought 5 years ago to make it easier in a lot of communities to do ADUs. We'll also be looking at manufactured housing and making it easier for manufactured housing communities to be built, and using some of the existing language in the workforce housing law and applying that to manufactured housing. Third time may be the charm for a 4-plex bill, as has been done in other states. We've seen in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we've seen in Washington and Oregon, the elimination of single-family only zoning. This has failed twice so far in the New Hampshire legislature, but is likely to be reintroduced in 2024. We're also looking to see bills that will deal with the timing of approvals and allowing approvals made by local boards to survive future changes in regulations. And also, how does zoning get adopted anyway? In most communities in New Hampshire, it's traditional town meeting, which is pure democracy, which oftentimes is mayhem, and is not amenable to positive changes. So there may be some bills that we're looking for to provide greater process flexibility. We look to expand the jurisdiction of the Housing Appeals Board, which is a 2019 creation of the New Hampshire legislature that established an alternative means of appealing local decisions on housing and housing development. Instead of going to trial court, you can go to this expert panel to hear an appeal. It's much faster and is making really good decisions. The expansion would be possibly to include state-level permits in the jurisdiction of the Housing Appeals Board. And finally, funding for affordable housing development. What we observe is that the findings of the Zoning Atlas are informing how people think and talk about housing. Next slide. And where do we go from here? We have a lot of momentum. We launched in May of this year. That's phase 1, up to the launch. Phase 2 is, where do we go from here? The first question in the Q&A dealt with, do you plan to update? Yes, indeed we do. In fact, we plan to update every year because zoning gets changed every year, and we want the Zoning Atlas to be reflective of the current state of zoning throughout the state. So we will be incorporating the 2023 changes to zoning at the local level. We'll also be working on maintaining the high level of education to the general public, but also specifically to legislators. So when our legislature reconvenes in January, we'll be focusing on particular committees that have jurisdiction that is important for the question of housing and housing development. We also want to create a further democratizing all of this information, make it accessible really to everyone, not having to go into the zoning atlas necessarily, but get a dashboard on what your community is doing. We have 234 municipalities. We have some additional jurisdictions that have zoning power as well. Each of these will have a community dashboard that gives key indicators on them. One of the most important things that we keep getting asked about is, what about water and sewer? What's the impact of that? What's the availability of it? Are these parcels of land that are zoned this particular way, is there water and sewer available? We have struggled to get those data, but thanks to the work of our friend Noah Hodgetts at the Office of Planning and Development, we are going to be mapping out the water and sewer lines as an overlay to the zoning atlas. And finally, one of the best measures of whether something is working is, well, look to see what's getting built. So we're going to do the beginnings of what will, I hope, amount to a longitudinal analysis of building permit issuances, which serves as a proxy for actual construction, and associate that changes with building permits to changes in zoning ordinances. Lots more to do. Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Ben. So that pretty much wraps that up for our presentation. I'm sure we left a lot of things unsaid, but I want to thank my team for their presentations and thank all of you for listening and say now we have some time for questions and comments. So I'm going to turn it back over to Diane and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, everyone. That was a really enriching presentation, and I'm gonna start digging a little more. And I'm glad we were able to get to a couple of the Q&A questions. I'm gonna start us off with one and then turn to those that are still in the Q&A box. So I want to go back to your section on public reception. Of the 4 states or regional atlases that have been released under the NZA, each have garnered a significant local response, both from media but also private community members. But these responses might be going further than just reactions to the information. Seeing your slide on the survey responses about people's opinions on land reuse regulations, it's fair to say the Atlas is succeeding as a tool for public education. So my question has 2 parts. What facets of your Atlas do you think have been most legible to New Hampshire residents? Or in other words, what served as the most effective communication tools? So that could be your story map, with statistical findings, the interactive map, the static maps, or your public presentations, or even the media coverage. And the second part of the question is, of the responses you received, what were the common reactions, and did certain findings stand out more than others?
So I'll start with just a partial answer to the first question. I think, and I invite my colleagues to weigh in. I think upon reflection, if our Atlas, and I think it has been effective to some degree, but if it's been effective in changing public hearts and minds on what we need to do with our zoning in our communities, it's because of the tremendous media coverage we got. I think to be on the headlines, to have zoning and the headlines of the newspaper, it makes people pay attention. What's zoning and why is it important? So I think it brought to the average public member the attention about zoning and why it's important and how it's affecting our housing affordability. I think that more than anything may have moved the needle a little bit, but I want to hear from my colleagues on that. Any other thoughts on what you think, what aspect of our Atlas has maybe been most effective in maybe changing people's perceptions?
I mean, I think it's those statistics that we presented. I think that had a significant impact. Just looking at the kinds of bills that are being proposed, for instance, on manufactured housing, seems like it's directly ripped from the findings that we've announced from our Atlas.
Max, I'll kind of indirectly answer this by saying that, and this is really for the benefit of the audience who may be working on their own state zoning atlas. We hired a media consultant to help us figure out how to communicate. And I think that that was vitally important to our success. So we followed his advice. We put together a campaign that led up to the launch on May 9th, that made, in effect, really helped make a big splash when we did launch. And that was vitally important. The second thing is make it visually accessible. And here we've just been blessed to work with Rick Lederer Barnes, who has done tremendous work in making things so easy to understand visually, which is really important for a lot of people. And then finally, the findings. The findings are a quick, easy way to communicate essential, important points.
Well said, Ben. I'm curious from Noah, Emily, and Sarah, and which of the findings, I think this was the last part of Diana's question, which of the findings you think was most striking for people?
You know, the one that I keep hearing again is the, I'm gonna get the number wrong, is the parking requirements related to accessory dwelling units related to ADUs. I just hear cited over and over and over again, and just how, you know, people are just blown away by the fact that, you know, now we have data to show that a significant percentage of communities are requiring 3 to 4 parking spaces sometimes for a single accessory dwelling unit. And again, as a result, we now have likely potential bill next legislative session that's going to seek to remedy this issue as a result of the Atlas.
That's a great one. I just add one of the findings that Jason mentioned on lot size requirements, even for single family houses. So the most restrictive type of housing, detached single family housing in New Hampshire and other New England states, has to be on large lots or yards that are in a very different scale than much of the rest of the country. The New Hampshire Atlas team defined a small lot as less than an acre, but in other parts of the country, we might be talking about small lots of 1/10 of that size.
I guess I thought it was very stark, some of the findings and the difference between many communities allow 2, 3, and 4. We didn't dive into the study of that, right? In 5+, we had to figure out exactly where the lines were, but the allowance for a 5+ family versus a duplex, which should be a relatively simple thing, especially we have so many communities that don't have sewer and water, right? So a well and septic can really support a duplex, especially in the size of our lots. And seeing the very stark difference in zoning, that the change is at the 5+ family. And I think that really reflects the state law around workforce housing. And it showed me pretty clearly, while there's a balance everywhere, that there are certain things that state law really does affect downstream in all the different municipalities and how we zone and how we find solutions to real problems. So I think that was a very obvious, it was very visually stark finding.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go now towards some of the policy-oriented questions in our Q&A. So just up first, from Patrick, given your findings, do you think New Hampshire's zoning positions us to handle new development associated with proposed commuter rail expansion? Could New Hampshire ever pull off transit-oriented development, and if so, how?
I'm going to let some of our policy experts deal with that one. Ben or Noah or someone?
I laugh when I hear this question because the joke in New Hampshire is what transit? So there are discussions about commuter rail extending up from the Boston lines up to Manchester, Nashua, Manchester, Concord. But there is very strong political opposition to them as well. So that may be a long way off, but it might happen. The fact is that where the line is likely to go is the best place for TOD. And I think that those communities, in particular Nashua and Manchester, would be eminently able to handle the demand created by a commuter rail line, and the ability, they'd have the ability to design their ordinances and handle the development process.
So just moving along with our questions. From Joseph, you mentioned that current zoning restricts new development on single-family homes across much of New Hampshire. Do you disagree with the idea that zoning for multifamily housing instead would increase housing supply? And I think this echoes the next question. Why not just allow 2 or 4 plexes in addition to single-family housing versus eliminating single-family zoning? I think
Jason, go ahead.
Well, I wonder if the latter question might be possibly a misapprehension about single-family zoning. So single-family zoning means single-family only zoning. So getting rid of single-family zoning doesn't mean that single-family residences would then be prohibited. It just means that you could build things other than just single-family residences. So, yeah, I think that's what this 4-plex bill would do. Where there's sewer infrastructure, you'd be allowed to divide your home into up to 4 units if you wanted to, but obviously you would not be required to do that, and you'd be allowed to build single-family homes on vacant lots and things like that. My view is that we needed to make it more possible for New Hampshire residents to get single-family starter homes with the kind of subdivision that you see in, say, the Sun Belt, where they, take 100 acres and they roll it out with a bunch of homes, and that's affordable to do because the lots are small. That's very difficult to do in New Hampshire. So I think we need more of that, but we also need more multifamily. So it's sort of both and. I don't think it has to be an either or. I know that some of the political types I've spoken to, when asked about the 4-plex bill and why it failed, they felt that the emphasis on multifamily was putting more kind of the burden, so to speak, on urban areas. And so the politics of this, it may be more useful to do both, right? To require suburban areas to do something with their lot sizes at the same time as you allow a little more multifamily in the urban areas.
Great. Does anybody else want to add to that? Okay.
So I'll jump. Actually, I have another question. While we're still on the housing policy question, it's obviously, as you said, the biggest issue facing New Hampshire right now. Were there any findings your atlas revealed that you think challenges common assumptions of why the state is in a housing crisis?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the average public member thinks. I suspect that they probably think there's a number of factors involved, including the cost of building homes, the availability of land. I don't know. I defer to some of our community experts like Sarah. What do you think is the average perception as to why there's a housing crisis?
I think you're right. I think most people see it as a complicated, multifaceted problem, right? And I don't think that changes. What I do think this did is it gave a visual representation across the state of how pivotal zoning is. And I think because it's so misunderstood and it's almost like a foreign language, that most of the average person doesn't understand even what zoning is or how it would have an effect. And so what I do think this did is it really made it consumable in a simple way and visually consumable, so that people are talking now about zoning as part of a solution to this housing crisis, instead of just talking about, we'll just build more, right? Or some of the other things. I think it's helped to add this dimension as a real conversation piece as part of the solutions going forward.
Great, thank you. And then we'll wrap up with some of the data and logistics questions. So from Anonymous, attendee says, great presentation. What are some challenges the Zoning Atlas project team encountered with gathering data and buy-in with local jurisdictions with land use control? For instance, was zoning data readily accessible in GIS digitized format? And in those cases, were localities willing to share that data for the project? What partnerships proved most fruitful in creating the atlas? How were challenges overcome in cases where zoning data that leads with housing affordability advocacy? Sorry.
So there's a lot of good questions there. We can start with Jason and Rick and maybe even Noah on the collection of the data and the buy-in from localities.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the majority of localities that we contacted were helpful, and we sometimes had questions about zoning maps in some cases where towns had areas that seemed to be omitted from their maps. Turns out they were, maybe conservation areas that they didn't bother to zone. Things like that. We did have one case where we asked for permission. I believe we asked for permission to get the GIS shape files for their zoning map from their contractor, and the Board of Selectmen decided to have a vote on whether they should give us this permission, and they voted not to give us this permission. So we definitely had some pushback from localities. But I think the vast majority did let us use their GIS data when that was available. Of course, a lot of them did not have that available, and we had to go and either try to digitize PDFs, digitize hand-drawn maps in one case, with that was shaded with crayon, and in other cases just take photos of their paper maps at town hall.
And in terms of partnerships, I was going to add, we partnered with, the state has 9 regional planning commissions. I know they're referred to as regional planning agencies. We don't have county government. We have these regional planning agencies in New Hampshire. And a lot of them maintain GIS layers of their zoning. And so that also helped to fill in the gaps for several communities that we were having trouble. My office, the Office of Planning and Development, also tracks land use regulations. So we also, luckily for us in New Hampshire, had some level of base of kind of a copy of almost every ordinance, or linked to every ordinance, to kind of start from some point. So we weren't really starting from scratch.
Rick, do you want to add anything?
Just for those people who are considering collecting data from communities in their jurisdictions, you may run up against the barriers that we did too. And Jason mentioned that community that took a vote no, even though it's a public record. We opted not to rely on our public records law and demand those data, because we didn't want to alienate the communities, and we didn't want to have that kind of baggage associated with our zoning atlas. So that was a judgment call on our part.
And I would just tack on then to conclude, what other advice or recommendations would you have for other states working on both gathering their geospatial data, all the zoning codes, building teams from the ground up?
Well, I'm sure there's everybody here on this team would have some bit of advice. From my own perspective, I think starting off with the right collaborations, getting the right partners within the state, the right constituencies on board, is really important for establishing the credibility of the project going forward, and hopefully enhancing its impact. And the second thing I would say is, as Ben had mentioned earlier, I do think getting some advice on how to enhance the impact of the media, it can be very valuable, because that can shape perceptions of the atlas and hopefully enhance its impact. But other people probably have some thought.
I guess my 2 parting thoughts are: A, going back to the media. We had this whole, which Max kind of alluded to, we had this whole kind of pre-launch kind of buildup of interest. We did some, kind of stakeholder meetings with to kind of, so people knew that this was coming. And so there was already kind of a lot of pent up interest, which I think helped kind of bring additional attention to the actual launch. The other thing, and maybe Jason, you can talk about this quickly, there's a question here about overlays. And so we made the decision relatively early on. I think the NZA methodology was not as detailed at the time, to only map overlays that we could actually identify kind of fixed kind of boundaries. So we have not, in our current rendition of the Atlas, mapped overlays like aquifer protection districts or surface water setback overlays, for example, that have a boundary that's somewhat dependent on geological features that may not be totally mapped in the zoning map. That made this project a little bit more, from my perspective, a little bit more achievable. And so that, Jason, I don't know if you want to kind of comment on that question more.
Yeah, I typed something in the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we do have all of those districts in the data sheet, including things like telecom overlays, but we didn't bother mapping overlays that really affected none of the housing variables. Those are not mapped, and also the ones that don't have fixed legal boundaries on a map, but instead depend on, potentially changing definitions of a floodplain or of the presence of wetland vegetation, right, for determining a wetland overlay. Those we have in the data sheet, but we didn't map them. So really, actually, all the findings that we have about the percentage of land area where these things are available, those are kind of best case scenarios, because some of these overlays actually restrict development further in some of these, near wetlands and things like that.
Okay.
Like,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You can have the last
this
word.
is a quick thing. I think we had the luxury of nobody knowing this was going on when we were building it, that I don't necessarily know that others will have, and some friends I've talked to from other states who are diving into this. So we did have the luxury of people not being super nervous about us building this database because they didn't know we were. But I think either way, you build the database, but one of the really good things we did is we said, this isn't perfect, and here's the email address for any error you find. We want you to tell us, we want you to know. It's important for us to get this right. And we make those edits, right? As soon as we get them, we make those edits. And so I think that that's a really key part of the rollout that I just want to focus on for everybody else, because it doesn't matter how hard you work, you won't get it perfect at first. But by saying that, I think the community knew we were trying to create a legitimate, accurate database. This was not politically driven in any way, and it's about the data.
We've also been very clear that we're open to people submitting corrections, and we want to make this more accurate over time as well.
Great. We are officially 2 minutes over time. So I think that is a really wonderful place to end. Again, thank you all. Thank all of our participants today. Thank you all, everyone who attended and asked questions. I think this is a really fruitful conversation, and we will see you for the next State Zoning Atlas reveal. Bye-bye, everyone.